You know, I'm reminded of the 17th century English physicist and mathematician Isaac Newton. And he has this third law of motion. And that third law of motion says that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The third law of motion. Is it too early for physics? It seems like it is. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Now, of course, Newton is dealing with the world of physics, but this law also has application to our lives as disciples of Jesus Christ. It seems that there is a give and a take with the universe. Some call it karma. Karma just means like action or deed, that what goes around comes around. Maybe you've heard of the law of attraction, that whatever we put out there in the universe somehow, some way, circles back around to us. So if that be the case, don't you think that it is wise for us to put good out into the universe, to give back to the universe our very best, all that we are, to give that back? The Bible talks quite a bit about giving and giving back. In fact, the word pray is mentioned in the Bible some 289 times. The word love, which Jesus said was the most important commandment, the greatest commandment, that's in there around 363 times. But the word give in some form is in there around some 1,043 times. So there's a lot written in the Scriptures about giving, what we put out into the universe. And of course, we have been in our stewardship campaign time these last few weeks, and we've heard about the importance of giving back and what we put out into the universe, what we give back to God. Because whatever that is, again, somehow, some way, will come back to us. Why is giving important? Before we actually get any further into the text, giving is important for a number of reasons, I think. Number one, giving is important because it helps us conquer greed and materialism. It's maybe a natural tendency for all of us to just need more stuff, or we want more stuff. But you know this as well as I do, more is not always better when it comes to stuff. But giving has a way of breaking that need within us, of having more stuff or somebody else's stuff or better stuff. It breaks that hold that greed and materialism can have. So it's a very helpful thing for us in terms of giving it back to the universe. How else is giving also important? Well, giving is important because it helps us to properly manage God's resources. Giving back to others is a part of what it means to be a good steward. And if we hold on to what God has given us, we are really not properly managing the gifts or honoring the gifts that God has given to us. Why does God give to us? God gives to us because God blesses us, but it doesn't stop there. God gives to us so that we will be blessed, but also, and maybe even more so, so that we can be a blessing to those around us. And then the third thing of why giving is important is it helps open ourselves up to receive God's special blessings. Giving back, in a way, is the key to receiving from God in a way that we have never received before. So that's a part of why giving is so important. What we put out in the universe. So with that in mind, there are three things that I want to share with you today in terms of what is it that we are to give to God. What is it that we put out into the universe? Well, the first thing is this. We are called to give God, number one, our very best. What is your very best? Whatever it is, give it back to God. I think of Proverbs. Chapter 3, verses 9 and 10, it says this, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of your crops. The first fruits of your crops. And then it says that then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with the new wine. So you see what's happening here is the writer of Proverbs is talking about the first fruits of the crops that they would give back to God. And what they hear later in that verse is that when you just give the first fruits, when you give the very best that you can give, God honors that and responds in a way that blesses us even more. Now, a little disclaimer here. This is not a prosperity gospel. Okay? That's not what I'm talking about at all. Many people buy into that. Well, you give a little and then God will... No, God doesn't work that way. God gives back to us not because God has to, but because God wants to. That's a part of the nature of who God is to give back His glorious gifts to us. So we're called to just give our first fruits. Give the best. The first fruits they were the choice examples of a harvested crop. And these are what were dedicated to God in the temple. In accordance to the Mosaic law, individual Israelites brought to the house of the Lord the first and the best of the fruits of the land as an offering to the Lord. And as a result, God blessed them, saying, your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with this new wine. So in the same way, we still do that today. We may not be farming or anything like that, but we still have the first fruits of our own lives, the first fruits of our time. Give God your very best in terms of your time, of your talents. Every single person in here is talented. Every single person in here has one or more spiritual gifts that God has given to you. Are you giving that first fruit of your time and your talents back to God? Well, even there's also not only the time and the talents, but there's also our treasures. Again, the best that we have, that God has blessed us with, are we giving that back to God? In the New Testament, I think of when Jesus was anointed at Bethany by Mary, the sister of Martha. And in the midst of a dinner honoring Jesus, Mary came to Him, and she did something that raised a few eyebrows. Mary comes to Him, and she breaks this very expensive bottle of perfume, and then she anoints Jesus' feet with that perfume. What is going on here? Well, one of the lessons that we get from that is that here is Mary. She is giving back to Jesus her very best. This is what she had to offer, and she gave it to Jesus. That was the very best she had to give. And as a result, we read later that Jesus honored her and blessed her. You see, we are called to give God what is right and not what is left. Let's don't give God just the leftovers in our lives, but let's give God our very best. And the message that we get from Scripture is that somehow, some way, these things come back to our lives, back into our lives, even to the point of overflowing. We think of maybe the great exchange, but when it comes to God's economy, when we give to God, God always somehow finds a way to give back more. You can't outgive God. Indeed, it is a greater exchange. When we give to God our very best, God always responds in a way that is an upgrade. It's always better and it's always more. It's the greater exchange. Whatever we put out, God finds a way to bring it back into our lives. And by the way, again, I've been harping on about stewardship and about tithing, and I came across this little thing I wanted to share with you. Maybe it has something to do with Chapel by the Sea, maybe not, but it is the top 5 reasons we should tithe. Do you want to hear the top 5 reasons? Okay, about 5 of you do. All right. Okay. The top 5 reasons we should tithe, why we should give God our very best. Well, number 5, there's no money for new choir robes, so the choir has started wearing their bathrobes during service. That's a good reason, right? What about number 4? The last few Sundays, the treasurer has gotten up halfway through the service and turned the AC off. I know these are bad. Just bear with me. What about number 3? You tried to call the church office last week but found that the phone has been disconnected. What about number 2? Parking meters had to be installed in the church parking lot. And maybe the number 1 reason we should tithe is, as a Christian, we understand the privilege it is to have a partnership in the gospel and to give God our very best. To give God our very best, because somehow, some way, my friends, it always comes back to us. Jesus described it like this. He says, give and it will be given to you. And it seems like there's just a direct exchange there, right? But we see later in this passage that it's even more, that God's response is even above and beyond. He says, give and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap. For with the measure that you use, it will be measured back to you. You see, there's not just a great exchange that takes place between us and God, but there's an even greater exchange, because when God responds, it's always above and beyond. It's always overflowing. So, my friends, today and every day, give God your very best. But what else should we give back to God? Not only should we give God our very best, but let us also give back to God our very worst. Our very worst. In Matthew chapter 11, one of my favorite verses from the gospel, Jesus says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens." Does that describe anybody in this place? Maybe sometimes you feel weary. You feel like you're carrying those heavy burdens. Well, maybe it describes all of us. But when we come before Jesus and we lay those down before Him, this is what He says: I will give you rest in return. Lay down whatever it is that is making you weary and tired, whatever those heavy burdens are that are weighing upon you. Come, lay them down. And He says, I will give you rest. You know, whether or not we're here today, and no matter what we are laden with, no matter what we are struggling with, maybe it's a financial burden. Guess what? Lay it down. Give it to God. Maybe it's a physical burden of some sort. Lay it down. Give it to God. Maybe it's an emotional burden. Give it to God. Maybe it's sorrow and grief. Give it to God. No matter what it is, even our very worst, lay it down, and somehow, some way, God will respond with His divine gifts. He will respond with His rest. You know, all of these burdens, the worry, the anxiety, anger, bitterness, whatever it is, why is it, my friends, that we have a tendency, if you're like me, of hanging on to those things? Why do we hang on to our very worst? It's like they are precious to us or something. It's like, no, this is mine and I will never let it go. And yet today we are called to give God even our very worst. Don't hang on to that stuff. It's not doing anybody any good. Don't hang on to any anger, to any bitterness, sadness, unforgiveness, any kind of attitudinal problem, negative words or perceptions, worries, low self-esteem, unhealthy anything. Give God our very worst. Give it all to God and receive rest. I'm reminded of a poem called Letting Go, and I'm just going to read a portion of this to you. But it says that letting go is one of the hardest lessons in life. Yet over changing seasons and passing time, you will have to learn to let go of certain people, relationships, situations, and things that fall way beyond your control. As life likes to dish out surprises and challenges, sometimes it is only through letting go, when your heart cries in anguish, that in the agonizing process that you realize what is truly worth holding on to. Letting go does not signify weakness, as it might take more courage to let go than holding on. Like the big, inflexible tree that snaps in the storm, while tiny blades of grasses yield and live on, revealing the strength of letting go. My friends, we're called today to let it go, to give to God our very best, and to give to God our very, very worst. So that's what we're called to give, the very best, the very worst, and guess what number 3 is? Everything in between. You give God your very best, you give Him the very worst, and then give Him everything in between. There are no parts of our lives that should be separated from God's presence. You know, it was said that God's fingerprints are all over our lives. I think it's more than just fingerprints. I think the hands of God, that all of us are in the hands of God. We may not realize it. We may not believe it. But it's not just God's fingerprints that are all over your life, but it's God's hands. You are in the hands of God. And then the best, the worst, and everything in between is actually in God. I think of the passage from the Gospel of Luke chapter 21. It's that widow's offering. She gave an offering in the temple. And it says that as he looked up, Jesus saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. He says, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has put in more than all of the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. Why do I read that passage? She gave God everything. And in return, she received a commendation from Jesus, plus so much more that we don't even read about. She gave everything, the best, the worst, and everything in between. And that's what we're called to do today, to put everything, our whole lives, back into the hands of God. You know, I think of the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a Lutheran pastor, and he took a stand against Nazi Germany. And he was put to death because of his convictions. And he wrote a book before his death entitled The Cost of Discipleship. It's a classic. And if you have never read it, I encourage you to do so. But it's here in The Cost of Discipleship, Bonhoeffer said that God's grace is costly because it calls us to submit our lives completely to the cause of Jesus Christ, to give Him everything, the very best, the very worst, and yes, everything in between. Before I close, I just want to share one other passage with you from Matthew chapter 16. Jesus said to His disciples, and He says to you and me, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me, he shall find it. So, all in all, we are called today to give God our very best, give to God our very worst, and everything in between. We are called to put it all into God's hands, and as a result, He puts His very best in our hands, even to the point of overflowing. When God gives back to us, He not only gives us a little, but He gives us a lot. I think of King David in Psalm 23, that passage where he talks about that my cup runneth over. Do you know what I'm talking about? See, that's what happens when God receives from us, God gives back, and God fills up our heart with His gifts. The gifts of love and joy and hope and peace. Those are the things that really matter. He gives those things to us. But He not only gives them to us, but He gives them to us to the point of overflowing. See, that's the way this divine principle works. And as Jesus said, give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured unto you. And that, my friends, is the greater exchange. Amen.